A United States Marine sentry stood at the perimeter gate of a major American compound in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam in 1969 and lowered his M16 at a man he did not recognize. The man in front of him wore black cotton pajama trousers caked in red volcanic mud, a stained tiger stripe shirt with no visible rank, sandals cut from old truck tires, a Montagnard woven bracelet on one wrist, a captured AK-47 magazine pouch on the other, and a face so darkened by sun and grease and 3 weeks of jungle rot that the sentry could not have told you with any confidence what nationality this man was. The sentry pointed his rifle and spoke 6 words that would become a kind of black joke in the Australian advisor community for years afterward. "Civilians are not permitted here." The man in the pajamas did not raise his hands. He did not produce identification. He looked at the 19-year-old boy holding the rifle, looked at the wire, looked at the mess hall behind the wire where his squadron mates were already eating, and laughed. Wait, what? This man was not a civilian. This man was a serving Australian warrant officer of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the most decorated Australian unit of the entire war, a unit that produced 4 Victoria Cross recipients out of fewer than 1,000 men. He had just walked 23 kilometers through Viet Cong-contested jungle, leading 200 Montagnard tribesmen on a contact mission against North Vietnamese regulars. He had 3 confirmed kills from that morning alone, and the United States Marine Corps private holding him at gunpoint had no idea, because the Australian was not wearing anything the United States Marine Corps recognized as a uniform. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what happened in the next 90 minutes inside that guard hut, the phone calls that escalated up 3 different national chains of command, the colonel from 5 Special Forces Group, who had to drive over personally to vouch for a man whose own army had effectively dressed him as a Viet Cong, would expose the single most uncomfortable truth about the American war in Vietnam. The men the Pentagon trusted to fight its dirtiest, deepest, most lethal missions in the Highlands did not look anything like the men the Pentagon trusted to guard its bases, and the men who did the dirty work knew it. The Australians especially knew it, because their own government, in the strangest piece of administrative reasoning of the entire war, had stopped issuing them proper uniforms years earlier and quietly told them to dress like the people they were fighting alongside. Stay with me, because by the end of this story you will understand why captured North Vietnamese intelligence documents from 1969 carried a specific warning about a category of Allied soldier they could not always identify on sight, soldiers their scouts called the White Tribesmen, and why those same soldiers, when they walked back through their own perimeter wire, were sometimes more likely to be shot by their friends than by their enemies. To understand how a decorated Australian warrant officer ended up at gunpoint at a United States gate in his own theater of war, we have to start with a uniform that almost did not exist. When the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam first arrived in country in August of 1962, the Australian Department of Defense had a clear and politically important instruction. The team would wear Australian uniforms. The whole point of sending the team was to demonstrate Australian commitment to South Vietnam as a distinct national contribution, separate from the United States, visible on the ground, recognizable in photographs. Australian soldiers should look like Australian soldiers. The instruction lasted about 6 months. The reality of the deployment broke it. The team was tiny, 30 men at the start, growing to around 100 by 1965 and peaking at 227 in November of 1970. They were scattered from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south, embedded in pairs and trios with South Vietnamese Army units, with Montagnard Hill tribes, with United States Special Forces A camps, with civilian irregular defense group companies, with the mobile strike force battalions known as Mike Force. They were fed through American supply lines because there was no Australian supply line that could reach them. Australian uniforms wore out in the wet heat of the Highlands inside 3 months, and replacement Australian uniforms came on irregular flights from Saigon to remote airstrips that sometimes took weeks to be cleared as safe to land on. The men at the sharp end stopped waiting. They drew what they could from American quartermasters. They drew tiger stripe utilities from South Vietnamese Special Forces stores. They bought black pajama trousers from local tailors in Pleiku and Kon Tum and Ban Me Thuot because the trousers dried fast and did not catch on bamboo. They cut their own boots open at the seams and replaced the soles with strips of Jeep tire because hard rubber rang in the leaf litter. Some team members, on long deployments with Mike Force units, wore essentially nothing identifiable as belonging to any national army: a pair of green trousers from one country, a jungle hat from another, a captured Chinese chest rig because it carried magazines better than anything the Americans issued, an Australian pattern slouch hat tucked into a pack for parade days that almost never came. By 1966, the situation had become embarrassing enough that the team's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Milner, ordered Warrant Officer Class II Laurie Nicholson to design a unit badge so that team members would have at least one identifying mark on whatever they happened to be wearing. The badge incorporated a boomerang, a Vietnamese sword, the motto "Persevere," and the suggestion of the Southern Cross. It was produced in Japan in small batches, then locally in Vietnam, then officially issued from public expense in September of 1969. By that point, the team had been operating without consistent national identification for 7 years. The badge was a partial solution. It was small. It was meant for the right shoulder of a uniform that the wearer might or might not be wearing. And it could not be seen from more than about a meter away. None of this was secret. The American command knew. United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam knew. The 5 Special Forces Group at Nha Trang, which integrated AATV warrant officers directly into its A camps and its Mike Force battalions, had been working alongside men in non-standard dress since 1964. At the operational level, the level of the captains and majors and master sergeants who were actually fighting the war, nobody cared what an Australian advisor wore as long as he could lead Montagnards into contact and bring most of them back. But the American war in Vietnam had 2 faces. There was the face that fought, and there was the face that guarded the rear. The face that fought was small, scattered, and forgiving. The face that guarded the rear was enormous, regulation-bound, and run by 20-year-old privates and corporals and military police sergeants who had been trained in San Diego and Fort Polk to recognize a soldier by his uniform and to challenge anyone who did not match the profile. The 2 faces met, sometimes painfully, at the wire of every major American base in country. And the warrant officers of the Australian Army training team, by the simple act of trying to walk back into their own beds at the end of an operation, kept running into the second face. The man at the gate that day in 1969, the man this script is loosely built around, would have been one of perhaps 60 Australian warrant officers operating with Mike Force units at that time, primarily out of the 2 Mobile Strike Force base at Pleiku, the 1 Mobile Strike Force at Da Nang, and the 5 Mobile Strike Force at Nha Trang. The pattern of their lives followed a specific shape. They flew in by Caribou or Hoi to a Special Forces A camp on the Cambodian or Laotian frontier. They linked up with their company of Montagnard strikers, between 100 and 200 indigenous fighters, mostly Jarai or Red or Bahnar or Sedang, men whose villages had been burned by the Viet Cong and who had every reason to fight. They moved out on operations lasting between 5 days and 3 weeks, often parachuting into drop zones the Mobile Strike Force had cleared just hours earlier. The Mobile Strike Force units made more combat parachute jumps than any other formation in the entire Vietnam War. They fought reinforcement missions, they relieved sieges, they conducted reconnaissance into areas no conventional unit would enter. And then they came home, dirty and tired, and reduced in number to bases that were mostly American. By the 2nd year of an Australian advisor's tour, the gap between how he looked and how the average American support troop looked had become almost cartoonish. The advisor was sun-blackened, underweight from a Montagnard diet of rice and chili, bearded because he had not shaved in weeks, scarred from leeches and shrapnel and bamboo cuts, dressed in whatever combination of locally sourced material had survived the operation, and carrying a personal weapon that often was not the weapon his army officially issued. Some carried CAR-15S, drawn from American stores, because the shorter weapon was easier in the bush than the Australian self-loading rifle. Some carried captured AK-47s because ammunition resupply in a contact would mean grabbing it off the dead. Some carried sawn-off shotguns for door-to-door work in fortified villages. The American support troop, by contrast, lived in a tent or a hooch with concrete pads, ate 3 hot meals a day in a mess hall, drew clean fatigues from the laundry every week, and had likely never been outside the wire in his life. When the two met at a guard post, the support troop saw what his training had prepared him to see, which was a threat that did not match any of the recognition templates he had been issued. He saw, in plain language, a Viet Cong who happened to speak English. The phrase that came out, in some recorded version or another, in incident after incident across 1968 and 1969 and 1970, was always some variation of the same line. "Civilians are not permitted here." Or, "Hold it right there, mister, this is a restricted area." Or, "I don't care who you say you are, I don't recognize that uniform." The warrant officers of the team developed a tired, professional response to all of these. Some carried laminated identification cards in waterproof pouches. Some carried letters of introduction signed by 5 Special Forces group officers. Some, the older hands, carried nothing and simply waited for an American officer above the rank of captain to come over and sort it out, because they had learned that arguing with a 19-year-old with a loaded rifle was a losing proposition no matter who was right. The specific incident this episode reconstructs, the detention of a decorated Australian warrant officer at a United States compound gate by a young American sentry who took him for a civilian, was not a single event. It was a recurring event, documented in oral histories collected by the Australian War Memorial, in personal letters held in the National Archives of Australia, and in the post-war memoirs of AATV veterans. It happened often enough that warrant officers returning from operations would sometimes deliberately arrange to be met outside the wire by an American Special Forces buddy, a man who could vouch for them in person, because the alternative was being held at the guard post for 2 or 3 hours, while phone calls climbed slowly up the chain. To understand how it could keep happening, to understand why the United States Marine Corps and the United States Army's military police kept failing to recognize Australian advisors, you have to understand how the American war in Vietnam grew. By the time of the worst of these incidents, the United States had over 500,000 personnel in country. The vast majority of them were rear echelon. They were truck drivers, clerks, cooks, mechanics, signalers, port workers, and military police. They were in Vietnam, but they were not in the war, in the sense the Mike Force advisor was in the war. They lived in a parallel country. The Australian advisor crossed back and forth between these two countries at the end of every operation, and the crossing was where the friction lived. The crossing was at the wire. A specific reconstruction of how a typical detention would unfold runs roughly as follows, drawn from multiple AATV oral histories. The Australian warrant officer arrives at the compound by helicopter, by jeep, or, if he is unlucky, on foot from a closer drop point. He has been in the field for between 10 and 20 days. He has not bathed, not in any meaningful sense. He smells, in the words of one captured Viet Cong intelligence assessment of Allied soldiers, of the jungle, of fish sauce, of old blood. He approaches the gate. The sentry sees him. The sentry does not see an Australian. The sentry sees a man of indeterminate age, in clothing that does not match anything in the United States Army Field Manual for the recognition of Allied personnel. The sentry challenges. The Australian who has done this before identifies himself by name, rank, serial number, and unit. He uses the words Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, or more often, AATV, attached to 5 Special Forces Group, advisor to 2 Mobile Strike Force. The sentry has never heard any of these words in his life. The sentry's training has not included the existence of foreign warrant officers operating in mixed dress with indigenous troops. The sentry calls the corporal of the guard. The corporal of the guard arrives. The corporal of the guard looks at the man in the black pajamas and the tiger-stripe shirt and reaches the same conclusion as the sentry. The corporal calls the sergeant of the guard. The sergeant calls the officer of the day. The officer of the day, depending on his service and his attitude, either picks up the phone immediately to 5 Special Forces Group liaison or decides he wants to assert his authority and orders the Australian held in the guardhouse pending verification. If the second outcome, the Australian sits on a wooden bench inside the guard hut for an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. He is offered water. He is not offered food. His personal weapon is taken from him and placed on a shelf where, as some warrant officers ruefully noted in post-war accounts, it was occasionally examined with surprise by Americans who had never seen a captured AK-47 carried by an ally. Phone calls go up. Phone calls come back. The verification eventually arrives, often in the form of a Special Forces officer driving over personally, because verbal confirmation alone is no longer sufficient. The Australian is released. He goes to dinner. He does not file a complaint, because filing a complaint would mean writing a report, and the team had developed a strong cultural preference against writing reports about anything that did not directly involve the enemy. The next day he goes back into the field, and 3 weeks later it happens again, perhaps at a different gate, perhaps at the same gate with a different sentry, but always the same 6 words in some version. Civilians are not permitted here. What made these incidents culturally significant, what lifted them from minor administrative annoyances to a kind of standing diplomatic problem, was the rank gap they exposed. An Australian warrant officer, Class 2 in 1969, was not a young soldier. The average age of an AATV warrant officer was 35, and many were in their late 30s or early 40s. They had served in the Korean War, in the Malayan Emergency, in the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo. They were among the most experienced soldiers in the entire Allied force in Vietnam. Several were Distinguished Conduct Medal holders. Some, by the late stages of the war, were Victoria Cross holders. Warrant Officer Class 2 Keith Payne was awarded the Victoria Cross for an action on the 24th of May, 1969, near Ben Hiet, leading his Montagnard company through a North Vietnamese assault that some estimates put at over 1,000 attackers, then walking back into the contact area at night to rescue wounded soldiers his battalion had left behind. Warrant Officer Class 2 Rayan Simpson was awarded the Victoria Cross for an action on the 6th of May, 1969, just 18 days before Payne, during which he held a position alone with a wounded American officer while under sustained enemy fire. Both men were photographed together in Saigon shortly afterward, the only two living Australian Victoria Cross recipients in country at that time. Both men, almost certainly, had been challenged at gates. Both men, almost certainly, had been told at some point in their service that they did not look like soldiers. There is a particular quiet humiliation in standing inside a guard hut, having your identity verified by phone, when there is a Victoria Cross in your record and a young Marine with no combat time is asking you to prove you are not a Vietnamese cleaner who somehow wandered onto an American base. None of the Australian warrant officers in any recorded oral history complained about this in heated terms. The tone was always wry, always understated, always returning to the same observation. The Americans did not know who we were because we did not look like them, and we did not look like them because their own special forces had asked us to dress this way. This is the part of the story that explains everything else. The Australians were not in their odd uniforms by accident. They were in their odd uniforms because the Americans most familiar with them, the 5 Special Forces Group, had specifically wanted them in those uniforms. The Mobile Strike Force concept depended on the indigenous soldiers, the Montagnards, and the Nung, and the Khmer Krom trusting their advisors. That trust had to be earned, and one of the first ways to earn it was to dress the way they did, eat the way they did, fight the way they did. An Australian advisor who arrived at a Montagnard company in starched green uniform with polished boots and a clean rank slide on his collar was an outsider. An Australian advisor who arrived in tiger stripes and Ho Chi Minh sandals, who could squat over a fire and eat dried fish and talk in basic Banar or Jarai, was a person the Montagnards would follow into contact. The Special Forces had learned this lesson before the Australians arrived. American Green Berets had been wearing local pattern fatigues, growing facial hair, and adopting indigenous customs since the early 1960s. There was even an institutional shorthand for it inside the Special Operations community, the practice of operating in non-standard uniforms for reasons of force protection, indigenous integration, and operational effectiveness. The Australian advisors slotted directly into this framework. From the perspective of the United States Army Special Forces, the AATV was just another component of the same advisor mission, distinguishable from American Green Berets primarily by accent and by the small Persevere badge on the right shoulder. From the perspective of a Marine sentry at a major rear base, the same Australian advisor was a stranger in pyjamas who could not produce a recognizable uniform. The two perspectives were both technically correct. They simply existed in different versions of the war, and the Australians, like the American Green Berets, lived at the place where the two versions touched. There was a second factor that compounded the recognition problem, and it was a factor the American command found genuinely difficult to address. The North Vietnamese had placed bounties on the heads of Allied advisors. American Special Forces sergeants and Australian warrant officers attached to indigenous units carried bounties that were calculated to reflect the operational damage they did. A Montagnard company, without its advisors, was a fraction as effective. Removing the advisors removed the leadership, the radio link to American supporting fires, the link to airborne resupply, and the institutional knowledge that allowed the company to fight North Vietnamese regulars on something approaching equal terms. Captured documents from late 1968 onward show that North Vietnamese intelligence had developed specific recognition protocols for identifying Western advisors operating with Montagnard units. The bounty for an Australian or American advisor reportedly ranged between $1,000 and several $1,000s, paid in either piastres or in promised post-war positions. To make the advisors harder to identify and therefore harder to specifically target in an ambush, dressing them down to look as similar as possible to the indigenous soldiers they led was deliberate operational policy. The same policy that protected the advisor in the field condemned him at the gate. The advisor who survived 3 weeks of jungle operations because no Viet Cong sniper could pick him out from the Montagnards he was leading, then walked back to his own base, and could not be picked out by his own side either. The protection mechanism worked exactly as designed. It just worked in both directions. A small number of Australian warrant officers were genuinely afraid of being shot at gates by their own side. Two post-war memoirs reference advisors who deliberately approached friendly bases at slow walking speed, hands visible calling out their names from a distance of 50 meters, because they had heard of close call incidents where a sentry had nearly opened fire. Whether these incidents resulted in actual deaths is not clearly documented in the available records. What is clearly documented is the fear that they might. The institutional response to the gate challenge problem evolved slowly through the late 1960s. 5 Special Forces Group eventually issued laminated identification cards specific to attached Australian personnel, cards that were supposed to be carried at all times and produced on demand. 2 Mobile Strike Force at Pleiku began the practice of phoning forward to expected receiving bases when an Australian advisor was inbound, so that the gate would have his name on a list. United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam published, in the form of a recognition supplement to its standard guard procedures, a brief description of the AATV unit badge and a paragraph of guidance reminding sentries that Allied Special Operations personnel might appear in non-standard dress and should be afforded reasonable verification time before any escalation of force. None of these solutions ever fully closed the gap. Sentries rotated through their assignments on a cycle of weeks. New sentries arrived who had not read the recognition supplement. The supplements were filed in places sentries did not look at. The phone trees were sometimes inaccurate, and the Australians kept walking into gates where they were strangers. By 1970, as the war moved toward Vietnamization and as Australian forces began their drawdown, the recognition problem began to solve itself in a different way. The AATV adopted a unit-distinct rifle green beret in early 1970, produced in Vietnam from low-quality pressed brass blanks for the badge, but distinctive in color and shape. Australian advisors operating in Phuoc Toi Province in the final years of the deployment increasingly wore green Australian field uniforms with the new beret because the operational rationale for non-standard dress was reduced as Mike Force units demobilized. The very last Australian advisor to leave Pleiku, Captain Peter Shilston, departed on the 26th of August 1970, ending the AATV's 7-year association with United States and Vietnamese Special Forces. By that point, the long argument over what an Australian soldier was supposed to look like had moved into history. The men who had spent years in pyjamas and tiger stripes went home to Australia and put on regulation green again, and most of them never wrote about what it had been like to be challenged at their own side's gates. The stories survived in oral histories, in Special Forces reunions, in occasional anecdotes told around tables, in country pubs in Queensland and New South Wales. It became a kind of private joke. The Americans never knew who we were, the joke went, because we did not look like them, and we did not look like them because they had asked us not to. The deeper meaning of the gate challenge phenomenon, the reason it matters as more than a curious footnote, is what it revealed about the structure of the American war. The Pentagon was running, in effect, 2 armies in Vietnam. The first army was the army of doctrine, of standard uniforms, of regulation appearance, of large bases protected by sentries who recognized soldiers by their kit. The second army was the army of advisors, of special forces, of Mike Force, of long-range reconnaissance patrols, of the men who actually pushed back into the highlands and the border zones where the war was being decided. The First Army did not understand the Second Army. The First Army, when it encountered the Second Army at its own wire, could not tell the Second Army apart from the enemy. This was not a failure of intelligence or training in the narrow sense. It was a failure of imagination. American military culture in 1968 had been built on the assumption that war was a thing you did with battalions and brigades, with massed formations and fire support and clear lines of friend and enemy. Vietnam was not that war. The men who succeeded in Vietnam, the small handful of Americans and Australians and New Zealanders who knew how to operate in jungle and in tribal society, and in the gray space where friend and enemy looked identical and acted similarly, were the men whose own institutions did not know what to do with them. They were the men who got challenged at gates. They were the men whose photographs in the official record showed them with beards and bracelets and weapons that did not match their issue. They were the men whose stories did not fit cleanly into the standard post-war narratives. The Australian warrant officers of the AATV embodied this contradiction more cleanly than any other group in the entire Allied force. They were the smallest unit. They were the most decorated unit. They were the most frequently challenged at the wire. They were the most useful to the men actually fighting in the highlands. They were the most invisible to the institutions that should have been recognizing them. And when one of them stood inside a guard hut on a hot afternoon in the Central Highlands in 1969 and listened to a Marine sentry tell him that civilians were not permitted in the compound, what he was hearing was not just a misunderstanding between one young American and one older Australian. He was hearing the sound of an entire war that did not know what its own best soldiers looked like. The number sometimes quoted in post-war reflections on the AATV is 1 to 15. The unit lost 33 of its 992 members across 10 years of operations, against an estimated kill ratio that ranged from highly favorable to extraordinary, depending on which operational period you examined. The unit was awarded over 100 decorations, including the 4 Victoria Crosses and the United States Army Meritorious Unit Commendation and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm. Its members trained, advised, and led in combat tens of thousands of South Vietnamese and Montagnard soldiers. Its work in the Central Highlands during the Mike Force years between 1965 and 1970 was, by the assessment of multiple 5 Special Forces Group commanders, indispensable to the survival of the indigenous strike force concept. And these men, these specific men, were the men most likely, on a given day, to be standing at a guard post, arguing with a young American who could not tell them apart from the enemy. They did not complain in print. They did not push for medals. They did not give interviews afterward demanding apologies. They went back into the field, and they came back through the wire, and they ate their dinners, and slept their few hours, and went out again. The Americans who fought alongside them, the Special Forces sergeants and captains and majors, never had any trouble recognizing them. The Americans who guarded the bases never quite learned to. And the gap between the two, the gap between the men who fought the war and the men who managed it, was the gap the Australian warrant officers walked through every time they came home. 6 words at a guard hut in the Central Highlands: "Civilians are not permitted here." The man in the pajamas was not a civilian. The man in the pajamas was an Australian warrant officer of the most decorated unit of the war, walking back into a base that did not know who he was. He was the war the Pentagon never quite saw, and the war the North Vietnamese never quite caught, and the war that, 50 years later, is still being recovered, one oral history at a time, from men who never thought their stories were worth telling. The pajamas are gone. The Mike Force is gone. The Central Highlands compounds are gone. The Marine sentry, if he is still alive, is in his late 70s now, and probably has no memory of the day he stopped a man at the wire. But the warrant officers remember, and the badge they wore on their right shoulder, the small badge with the boomerang and the sword and the Southern Cross, still says the word that shaped their war and explains everything that happened on the day this story remembers. Persevere. They did, and nobody at the gate knew it.